You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and this episode was made in partnership with the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona University.
The legacy of common sense, I think, is defined by an understanding that we are collectively in this together, that we as the nation, as different communities within this nation, are bound together, and that one singular person does not chart the course of our civic duty, of our civic engagement, and our republic. We are all born to reign, right? We are all born to collectively reign together. And I think that is a really singular thing to think about as we consider the complicated and inspiring and challenging and messy and disappointing legacies of the revolution. That strikes me as a really meaningful way to think about it.
Hello, and welcome to episode 431 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. On January 10, 1776, an anonymous pamphlet burst onto the scene in revolutionary America. Its message was plain, its language was powerful, and its title was Common Sense. Within months, it became known that Thomas Paine wrote this pamphlet, which sold an estimated 500,000 copies throughout the course of the American Revolution, meaning that approximately 20% of the U.S. population purchased this pamphlet. With its wide circulation, Common Sense transformed the conversation from reforming the British Empire to declaring independence from it. So 250 years later, we may be asking, what made Common Sense so powerful? Who was the man behind this pamphlet? And how did his experiences in England and revolutionary America shape the ideas that furthered the American Revolution? To help us commemorate the 250th anniversary of Common Sense, we're joined by Nora Slonimsky, the director of the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona University. Now, Nora is an expert in early American legal and communication history. She's also the author of the forthcoming book, The Engine of Free Expression, Copyright in the State in Early America. Now, together, we'll explore the experiences that shaped Thomas Paine into the writer who crafted Common Sense, how Common Sense changed public opinion and influenced the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, and what the legacy of Paine and his pamphlet mean for civic life today. But first, this episode is really exciting because this episode marks the start of an exciting new content partnership with the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona University. We're working together to create podcast episodes and digital videos that will take us inside the world of Thomas Paine and his famous pamphlet. Our goal in this partnership is to investigate the origins of the United States' Republican government and the ideas that shaped the nation. To learn more about this content partnership and when all this new content will be released, visit benfranklinsworld.com/Paine. That's Paine with an E on the end, and you can learn more at benfranklinsworld.com/Paine. Okay, now before I introduce you to our guest, I want to provide you with a note on Common Sense and its circulation numbers. All of the publication figures you'll hear throughout this episode are approximations. In 1776, Thomas Paine estimated that 150,000 copies of Common Sense were published in 1776. According to our resident media historian, Joe Edelman, that's not physically possible given the number of North American printing presses that were in operation in 1776. Now, historian Trish Logren believes that the real number that was published in 1776 is likely to be about 75,000 copies. Joe still thinks this figure is a little bit high, but it is much more in line with what could have been published over the 6 years of war between 1776 to 1781. With that said, it's also possible that printers printed as many as 500,000 copies of Common Sense over the course of the entire War for Independence, again from January 10, 1776 through 1781. Now, in our conversation, Nora and I discussed this latter estimate of 500,000 copies. Still, Joe, Nora, and I felt that you should have this clarification about Common Sense's publication statistics because they're all estimates. And these estimates really vary on the years that you're talking about for publication and on the different historians you read. All right, are you ready to explore the world of Thomas Paine and his wildly popular pamphlet, Common Sense? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Joining us is the director of the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona University, where she also serves as an associate professor of history and the chair of the history department. Her research expertise is in legal history, communication history, and book history in the 18th century world. And her first book, The Engine of Free Expression, Copyright in the State in Early America, will be published later this year. As a dissertation, this work won the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic Dissertation Prize and was a finalist for the Zuckerman Prize in American Studies. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Nora Slonimsky.
Hey, Liz. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Nora, part of the great work you do at Iona University is to serve as the director of the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies. Would you tell us about the ITPS and the work you do there?
Sure, absolutely. So the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies, or ITPS for short, was founded in 2011 to preserve a pretty unique archive about Thomas Paine's life and legacy and create educational opportunities related to that collection and its content. But since then, our mission has been focused on taking several of Paine's principles, especially involving things like civics and engaged citizenship, media and information literacy, and lifelong learning, and putting them into practice. And we do this in three big ways. The first is archival studies, the second is public history, and the third is digital humanities. From student and scholarly research projects, internships and fellowships, to public programming, events, and partnerships. For the ITPS, Paine is a gateway to understanding both the connections and changes between past and present.
So the ITPS, the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies, isn't just an academic institution that supports the work of scholarship. It is an organization that does that, but it's also an organization, it sounds like, that we can visit and attend public events with and really get involved with so that we can learn more about Thomas Paine and his legacy.
Yes, absolutely. And we really see ourselves as serving multiple communities. We, of course, are here as a resource for our students and colleagues at the university. That's our foundational audience, you might say. But we are very committed to community partnership, both locally in New Rochelle, around New York State, nationally, and internationally as well. New Rochelle itself has a pretty specific history and tie to Thomas Paine, which really does put us into international conversations about how we remember him today.
Well, let's dig into the man behind the Institute's name. In the United States, Thomas Paine is best known as the man who wrote Common Sense, that pamphlet that turned colonial anger at the British Crown and Parliament into a real movement for an independent Republican government. Nora, what do we really know about Thomas Paine as a child and his early life? And what about his early life do you think shaped Paine into the consequential writer that we remember him as?
So a young Tom Paine is an interesting character, you can say. Like many working class people, both of the 18th century and today, their lives, our lives, right, are less documented than those who have a tremendous amount of resources and wealth. Although I'd be curious to know how social media and digital footprints change that in the decades to come. But we do know some about Thomas Paine's upbringing. He was born in a town called Thetford in England in 1737 to a multi-faith household, which would also be relatively unique for everyone really at that time. His father was a Quaker and had a very strong pacifist commitment, which is also very important for understanding how Paine comes to be the way he is. And his mother was presumably Anglican because she was the daughter of the town clerk. And Anglicanism would have been the established church in England at that time. The first 10 years or so of his life are probably fairly typical for a young child in Thetford, which again is to use the term today, kind of like a blue collar or working class town in Eastern England. He attends school on a regular basis. He has a basic or foundational education. This would be things like grammar and reading, literacy, some English and even global history, right? The basics of mathematics, so on and so forth. But around the age of 12, he pivots away from what we might describe as quote unquote, like a proto-liberal arts or humanities type of education and goes into trade work. His father was a staymaker, which is most commonly going to be corsets, but also involves other activities with ropes, like ships, for example. And he works with his father. He apprentices with his father, which again is very common for a lot of working class people in this period who are going into a trade. They're going to spend a fair amount of time learning that work firsthand. And the first 20 or so years of his life, I should say, so the next 10 years thereafter, he kind of hops around from different professions. He's not unlike a teenager today who's trying to find their path or their way forward, right? Trying out different things. But where we begin to get the most documented sense of who he is when he begins work as a tax collector or an excise officer.
Yes. Would you tell us more about Paine, the English excisemen? What exactly do excisemen do, and do we know if Paine enjoyed this work?
Oh, these are two great questions. And I can get to be ever so slightly speculative, if that's okay for you and your wonderful listeners. An excise officer is a tax collector. The technologies certainly look different. They involve a lot more physical travel than they probably do today, but not unlike an IRS official or other accountants who work at the local, state, or national level in the United States, right? Their job is to collect the taxes that are owed to the government. And in the case of England, this would be Parliament and the Crown, the sort of branches of the United Kingdom of the English and Scottish governments. And Paine has, I would say, a complicated relationship with his job as a tax collector in that he has two stints. The first one is very short-lived. He leaves his apprenticeship and then his eventual work as a staymaker. He has a brief detour into working as a privateer on a ship, but then comes back. And then he leaves this work in what we might describe sort of as trade labor or trade work. And he becomes an excise officer. It does not go well. He goes back into a series of different jobs in an interim period. But then he finds himself in a town called Lewes, England. And Lewes is a really unique place for a couple of reasons. It's a unique place in that it has a very democratic form of government by the standards of the 18th century. While it is a part of the Crown and the broader English and British systems, there is a long-standing electoral culture within this town in terms of how they elect and support local leadership. And so Paine finds himself in this town, Lewes, becoming increasingly influenced by that democratic culture there. And this does inform his relationship with his job as an excise officer. He marries for a second time. I should share that Paine has two marriages in his life. The first marriage, which is when he's in his younger days and finding himself moving from career to career, his wife and child both die in childbirth, which from what we understand, once again, there's not a ton of surviving material on what he personally would have felt in that time, but it does seem to have had a very traumatic impact on him, as anyone can understand, right? That's a devastating loss across time and space for anyone. But he remarries, and in his time in Lewes, he marries a woman named Elizabeth Olivey, who's essentially a small business owner. She has a store where she sells groceries, tobacco, and other goods. And so her and Paine kind of developed this very successful life in Lewes with his second try as a tax collector. It doesn't necessarily last, the harmony, but there are a few years there where he becomes very steeped in both this job and in the democratic culture of the town.
If we think about the 18th century and the American Revolution in particular, taxes, of course, were one of the real ways that early Americans interacted with the British government. And as we know, they took real issue to being taxed without what they saw as true and fair representation in the British government. So, how did Thomas Paine experience the British government as an English tax collector, and how might his experience of collecting taxes have influenced his later views on Republican government?
So I would say that his time as a tax collector and this role and the relationship that a tax collector or an excise officer has to government is extremely influential. And it is in two ways. The first is that Paine is a government employee. The British government is his employer, is his boss. And on some level, you believe in a system, or you are at least tolerant of a system that you are working in. So we often talk about Paine as a radical and a firebrand, and he is those things in many ways. But he also does believe in institutions, and he believes in structures of governance. And that's very important. What his time as an excise officer really teaches him is the value of reform, is the value of trying to fix structures that, as flawed as they might be, that there's something important to saving them. And that's in some ways a very different story than the one of a revolutionary, right? So we get to see Paine in his more day-to-day practical outfit, how to make a situation work as well as it can within the structures that you exist in. And the second part about why his time as an excise officer is so significant is once again, I think, very much tied to his time in Lewis and the significance of this town. And to this day, Lewis has really vibrant democratic culture. It has really vibrant organizations, Thomas Paine Legacy, for example, that do a lot of great work around Paine and his memory. But in particular, Paine is able to play with a style of voice that we hadn't really seen yet in any of the surviving records. There's a very vibrant debate club in Lewis where he learns the skills of debate and persuasion. He watches firsthand how all male heads of household, and granted this is limited, it is just men, all male heads of household who pay taxes were able to vote, right? Which is, again, far more democratic than many other parts of the country because Lewis didn't have a royal charter. When he stays there for 6 years, he really does enjoy his life in Lewis, and Paine is very much a traveler of the world. He moves from place to place very often. And the only other spot besides New Rochelle where he has this sort of long documented time as an adult is Lewis. So I guess it's working within a structure of governance and trying to reform it and make it as good as you can, really showing that Paine believes in institutions, he believes in government. And on the other hand, the uniqueness of the democratic culture of Lewis.
Well, let's talk about reform, because again, if we think about the American Revolution, it was really an event that started as a type of reform movement. British Americans wanted to change the way the British government worked, including how they were taxed and represented in Parliament. And that's how North Americans viewed the event. What about Thomas Paine's experience with the British government? What were his ideas for reform of this government?
So the best piece of evidence we have about Paine's belief in reform is a pamphlet that he writes before moving to North America. And Common Sense, of course, becomes this smash hit. It's the bestseller of its day. In some ways, we can't even, I think, wrap our heads fully around how successful a publishing opportunity Common Sense is. But it's not his first. His first pamphlet that he writes is called The Case of the Officers of Excise, which is worth noting. There's been really interesting work on this text. Paul Miles wrote a really great book about this particular pamphlet, that it was not published publicly or widely circulated at the time. It only becomes a widely circulated text, 10, 20 years later. But he does publish, or he does print, he puts together a pamphlet called The Case of the Officers of the Excise, which is really a commentary on the working conditions and salaries of his fellow tax collectors. So Paine comes back into this job, right? He's giving it a second go. He's allowed to come back, which is no small feat. And he pretty quickly begins to observe conditions and issues that he has a problem with. He sees a fair amount of corruption. He sees, to use a term that flies around very frequently today, he sees a lot of inefficiencies, a lot of things that he thinks can be improved. Very specifically, though, the conditions of the people physically doing the work. Right? This is a very physically demanding job. It's a stressful job. Think about how we all feel during tax season. Multiply that by the physical demands of traveling around an extensive county on horseback or on foot, trying to get people to give you money. It's difficult. It's emotionally and physically draining work, right? And the conditions that many excise officers had did not support those conditions at all. So in many ways, the case of the officers of excise is an early attempt at unionization, you might say. It's a very pro-worker. It's very much a request, a petition, a series of demands for better working conditions. It does not necessarily go over well. It is not necessarily well received, which may in part explain some of Paine's choices when he comes to North America and why he comes to North America. But it's very much a unique pamphlet in that it makes this case for better working conditions. And that's a pretty unique contribution, if a far less known contribution than Common Sense.
Could we talk more about how Paine's first pamphlet, A Case of the Officers of the Excise, how that was received? Because, as you noted, this pamphlet wasn't like Common Sense, which was published and circulated very widely. This pamphlet seemed to be more niche, as we would say. It was about a very specific issue that impacted really only the excisemen of England and the English government. So I imagine that those were his two audiences for this pamphlet. So could you talk to us more about how this pamphlet was received?
Exactly. So the audience in this case, an audience is such an important word, thought, concept in all of these conversations, right? And in our conversation today, because you're not writing these things in a vacuum. They are designed to be read and considered or talked about, right? Discussed in one way or another. The intention with the excise pamphlet is to persuade government officials and government institutions to make these reforms. It's very much maybe wouldn't go so far as to say a list of demands, but it is certainly a request for change and a evidence-based request for change, right? Paine takes a lot of effort in the pamphlet to explain why less corruption is better for everybody. And certainly he is advocating for the demographic in question. He's advocating for their tax officers, right? For his fellow tax officers. So they might be the intended recipients, but they're not necessarily who he's trying to convince, right? They're already convinced. They would also like better salaries and better working conditions. So he's really trying to convince people in positions of authority to make these changes, making the case that I think is a pretty timeless one, that better working conditions for working people are better for everybody, right? Everybody wins. To use the sort of current modern day expression, right? Rising tides catch all boats. He very much sees it as like, well, if you make the conditions better, you'll probably get more revenue. You'll probably get more money in taxes if you make it easier for us to do our jobs.
I think we can see how Paine's time in Lewis really set him up to engage further with politics, especially when he arrived in North America, where many localities also practiced more democratic forms of government. But Nora, before we dive into Paine's move to North America, I wonder if you would tell us about his intellectual life in England, because like many artisans, Paine seemed to be really active and very involved with the Enlightenment and Newtonian science. So would you tell us about the salons and the lectures that he used to frequent?
Oh, totally. Yes. So Paine, and this might seem like a funny way to first answer the question, but I think in some ways, one of the coolest ways to understand Thomas Paine and the world around him is that Paine is a social media influencer, right? He is soaking up content right and left. He's a sponge. He's absorbing learning and thought and debate and discourse and all of the best parts of like being human. He's just really coming of age, both as a sort of a worker and a member of his community, but also as a thinker and a writer, an author, his authorial voice. All of this is coming together in this age of enlightenment. And he is deeply immersed in that exchange of ideas. Salons, right, are of course a feature of that, but also taverns, also coffee houses. One of the, I think, intriguing or cool things about the way that Paine understands both his work as an author and a thinker, as well as that of his peers, is he does not distinguish between kind of categories of work, right? He wouldn't see a difference between like Sir Isaac Newton and a staymaker. They're all part of this intellectual ecosystem, right? Where everybody can be a contributor. He's a deeply egalitarian person, and he believes in the best aspects of the Enlightenment. He believes in this deep love of learning and that we can all learn from each other and treat each other with dignity the more enlightened we are. And on the other hand, he acknowledges I wouldn't even want to say contradictory, but deeply compatible in a way that we still to this day, I think, square with relationship between Enlightenment and empire, right? And how those go hand in hand, right? Paine is very much at the same time that he's immersed in the best of the Enlightenment. He is also has complex and contradictory feelings about empire and thoughts about empire. In some ways, he's deeply critical of it. In other ways, he's not. So he really is in this mesh sort of web of all these different contradictory things. Where science specifically, there's lots of different ways you can think about Paine and science, right? The ways in which I find to be maybe the most unique is that Paine is also what today we might describe as an architect or an engineer. Once again, in the 18th century, right, these are all porous categories. Like folks don't think about art and science as separate in the same way. They don't think about different ways of intellectual work in these sort of siloed ways. They're all sort of free-flowing, quote, men of science, right? People of science. And Paine is deeply interested in engineering and in fact does design a bridge. The bridge is no longer standing. It's in a part of London that has long since been reimagined many times over. And I think in this work, there's a great book out there about Paine's Bridge as well. He applies for patents for some of his engineering designs and ideas. But I think that's a really cool way of thinking about Paine, is that he even takes art and science, combines them together, and applies them in what we might describe as a very practical way, right? How do you get from A to B, which is engineering, right? Which is what that work is.
It sounds that just like many of the other founders of the United States, Thomas Paine was a type of Renaissance man, right? He was part of the Enlightenment, his curiosity knew no bounds, and he also just seemed to follow his curiosity wherever it led him. So Paine was a man of the Enlightenment. But I also think we should consider Paine as a man of the people, given that he interacted with elites, he interacted with skilled workers, and with the everyday people and laborers, he was meeting in places like taverns and coffee houses.
So you know what it is? He's certainly a man for a lot of people. And as always, there's a lot of work yet to be done in more fully understanding Paine's views and relationships to enslaved people in North America, his views and relationships with indigenous people in North America, his views and relationship with women of all backgrounds. So there's a lot more understanding there. And what we do know, there is evidence that certainly indicates that he had to use this thread more enlightened, or we might say inclusive views in many respects, and also ways in which he did not have the most inclusive or enlightened views. But he certainly viewed himself in what we might say today very much as a man of the people when it came to questions of class and economic inclusivity. Completely and utterly did not distinguish between salons and the coffee houses. He did not really accept those categories, and not in a way that was naive or ignorant. He obviously understood very clearly that there was people with immense wealth and those who did not, right? That there were different types of jobs, that a lawyer's job functioned day to day in a different way than a farmer's job did, or a domestic servant's job would look different than a newspaper journeyman's job might, right? So he was not sort of naive, again, to reiterate, but he really saw in ways that perhaps many of his peers, I think, would see divisions amongst those categories of labor. Paine saw connections. We might use the term solidarity. He saw linkages between different types of workers in this kind of Enlightenment umbrella.
As Paine was circulating throughout London's salons and educational opportunities, he was also expanding his personal and professional networks. And one of the people that Paine met was Benjamin Franklin, who spent nearly 20 years in London working as a colonial agent, or someone who was really working as a lobbyist for the colonies that had hired him to represent them. Nora, Bruce would like to know more about Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin's relationship.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you, Bruce. So Franklin is kind of the mentor of the era, right? We're talking Ben Franklin's world, and it really is when it comes to mentoring younger men who might not know which direction to find themselves in. Again, it's not to imply that Paine was directionless by any means. In fact, he had a very singular focus on the kind of work and contributions he wanted to do. But to understand Paine and Franklin's relationship, I think it's very important to know where Paine was at the essentially like the moment that they met. Paine was deep in his advocacy for excise officers. He is just about essentially to lose that job, or that job is about to become very untenable because of that advocacy work. We know his marriage is struggling. And once again, there is conflicting evidence about the nature of the breakdown of his marriage and what's kind of going on in his personal life. But we know that things are not great, right? We know that things are not good and they could potentially be about to get worse. And right around the time that Franklin first makes Paine's acquaintance, it's in these learning environments, right? It's over this question of reform for tax collecting. And Franklin is impressed. He's impressed by Paine's intellect, by his expression of his ideas, right? It's both the ideas, but also how you share them. Once again, to use a present day expression, right? It's not what you say, it's how you say it. And that goes a long way. And so Franklin essentially facilitates Paine's travel to North America, to Philadelphia, where he then is going to go and live for quite some time. So I think the best way to categorize their relationship, once again, is as a mentor. Franklin looms very large for Paine. Franklin looms very large in the backdrop of many, both men of science and political activists of the period, and Paine's no exception, where Franklin seems to be particularly taken with Paine is his ability as a communicator and his ability to write and speak and take broad swaths of ideas and share them in a way that is wonderfully accessible and also very motivational.
It's time for us to explore Thomas Paine's move to North America in 1774. But first, let's thank our episode sponsors. Thank you for being a Ben Franklin's World listener. Making this podcast is a real joy for me, and it also takes real time and care. The work begins long before you ever press play, as each episode involves reading and research, preparing for our guests, editing, and shaping well-researched history into a conversation that's clear, engaging, and grounded in evidence. It also means making space for the questions that so many of us come here for, the daily lives of ordinary people in early America. What they ate, how they worked, worshipped, built communities, served on juries or voted, and made choices within the limits and possibilities of their world. It also means building resources that you can return to, like show notes and transcripts, so you can revisit an episode, follow a thread, and share it with someone else who might enjoy it. So if Ben Franklin's World has helped you see early American history in a new way by challenging a familiar story or introducing you to voices you hadn't heard of before, I hope you'll consider supporting this show with a donation. You can give once or become one of our ongoing supporters who donate monthly or annually. And a special thank you to Melissa M., Leslie R., Tyler R., Jennifer A., Zara A., Cindy B., and Mary B., because your generosity helps keep this work going. You can become a donor at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Your support keeps Ben Franklin's World independent, accessible, and on the air. So thanks for listening, and thank you for your generosity. Thomas Paine emigrated to British North America in 1774, in part because of his work as a tax collector, and then, as Nora said, a proto-unionizer of excisemen. Nora, could you tell us more about Paine's migration to North America and why, of all the places, he ultimately decided to first settle in Philadelphia?
Paine has a relatively arduous journey. From what we understand, he becomes quite sick in transit from England to Pennsylvania. It's a tough voyage for anybody, and he becomes pretty ill on that trip. It takes some time for him to disembark and settle into Philadelphia, where he takes up a room in a boarding house. And it winds up being a very interesting location because it's where he meets Benjamin Rush. It's where he meets his future colleagues, friends. He really kind of falls into Philadelphia circle through these lodgings, but it takes him some time to recover from that journey. So his start in Philadelphia is a little bit slow, you might say, but picks up speed very, very quickly. Philadelphia, it's the largest city in North America at this time. It's very cosmopolitan in many ways, and this also speaks to some of those tensions and stereotypes between London and other cities in North America about the metropole and cosmopolitanism and who's considered to be kind of the fanciest city and so on and so forth. But Philly really is a thriving cultural city. It's got incredible artistic and intellectual institutions, places like the American Philosophical Society, the Library Company of Philadelphia, right? Organizations that are still thriving and in existence today. And Paine is very taken with that intellectual life. And he quickly becomes involved. Robert Aiken, who is a printer and bookseller, as he would be called in the late 18th century. Today, we would say publisher, right? Essentially recruits Paine, Aiken's his neighbor in this boarding house that he stays in, to work with him on the Pennsylvania Magazine, which becomes one of the first, Time magazines of the age, right? It's a really popular publication. And when Aiken first starts this or works on it, it's much more, I would say, politically neutral. It doesn't really have necessarily as strong a voice one way or the other in the rapidly escalating conflict between the colonies and Britain. But when Paine steps in and gets involved, it takes a tonal shift quite quickly and does become, within a matter of months, increasingly critical of Britain publication. So he's in this Philly milieu and he's loving it and he's thriving.
Yeah, it sounds like Paine fell fairly quickly into Philadelphia society and was then given the editorial space he needed to really further explore and promote the political views he had started to develop in Lewis.
Yes, very much so. Lewis was really where these ideas were cooking. Once again, Lewis is a very unique place. A lot of the experiences he had there were pretty unique. He brings those into Philadelphia. and lightning strikes. And he falls in with this network of really remarkable people. And once again, folks from all different kinds of professional categories. You have physicians and other kinds of, quote, scientific professions, but you also have tradespeople of all different forms, printers, small shop owners, tavern owners, right? You have a really wide range of working people that Paine becomes involved with. And that also explains the success. That also explains the ability for him to read the room, right? That he can speak to all these different voices because he's in conversation with all these different voices. And that goes a long way.
I think some of us may be thinking that it feels like a natural connection for Paine to get along and feel in Philadelphia as he did in Lewis. He was in a place with a somewhat democratic form of government. He was already fed up with the English government from when he had been an exciseman. Plus, he'd been interacting with Benjamin Franklin and other Enlightenment thinkers who had ideas about how government might be reformed and made anew. So Paine landed in Philadelphia in 1774. The American Revolution and its protests are already in full swing by the time that he arrives. So I think we need to ask the question, Nora, are these connections that we're making for how Paine might have become a revolutionary real? Would you tell us how Thomas Paine viewed the American Revolution?
And this is the moment where you wonder what it would be like to be a fly on the wall, right? Because I'll get questions from students or wonderful audience members in different conversations, right? Like, when did Paine become a revolutionary? When was the moment? And Paine's so anti-government. He really doesn't like government. Is he just about burning things down? But it's like, actually, that's not it. We know that Paine really does believe in government. And on the one hand, you're like, oh, it's good to have a government job, right? It's stable. We take a lot of our present day notions and kind of read them back. As Paine told us, being an excise officer was not a great job. It was not the easiest job. And he was coming out of different trades, right? Working in stay-making, working as a privateer, doing these different kinds of work. So we had a pretty clear sense of what different types of professions looked like. And he did proceed to go back into excise collecting on some level because he thought it was a worthwhile enterprise and because he understood that if you want government to be able to do good things, you need resources to do it. So we know that almost to the minute that he is coming to North America, he believes in the value of governing institutions and the importance of funding them. And I really stress that point because I think that's very significant in understanding exactly where Paine comes into the movement for independence. Because once again, he does not mince words, right? This is why, again, I think he would really thrive in ways that are both awesome and also terrifying on social media today because he does not mince words. He's very clear about what he thinks. And it's fairly evident that he believes, perhaps because of his experience attempting to work with the British government, attempting to advocate for reform, that they're not a good faith actor, that you're just not going to get anywhere with them. So if you're not going to get anywhere with them, but you know that government institutions are important, and more specifically, that democratic institutions are very important, then what are you waiting for, right? What are you waiting for? And that is his entry point. That is where he is at. He tried, it didn't work. So he's not going to keep attempting the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, right? And so when you see this voice emerging in the Pennsylvania Magazine, you see the lessons that he learned in Lewis and through the excise work. He's taking those lessons and he's bringing them in to contribute to the already existing fermentation around independence here. He's both learning from his colleagues, his social networks, and contributing to them at the same time.
Now, on January 10, 1776, Thomas Paine published what would become the most consequential writing of the American Revolution outside of the Declaration of Independence. And this writing, of course, was Common Sense. Nora, what is the story of this pamphlet? If Paine published it on January 10, 1776, he must have been thinking through his ideas in this pamphlet and writing them down at least by late 1775 or possibly even earlier in 1775.
Like many other essayists of the time or pamphleteers of the time, and frankly, this is going to last all the way into the 19th century too, with authors like Charles Dickens or the Brontes or Austen or anyone, right? You really do conceive of a lot of your work in a serial way. So Paine initially conceives of what we now know as common sense as something that he's going to publish as a series of articles in the Pennsylvania Magazine, right? That he's going to take these views and he's going to publish them on a regular basis. And that's how he's going to up the ante of what he had already been doing, again, with his friends and colleagues in collaboration in the Pennsylvania Magazine. A series of individuals in his life, again, Franklin looms sort of very large in the background. Benjamin Rush is a very close confidant at this time. Once again, his publisher of the Pennsylvania Magazine, Robert Aiken. Their advice begins to shift that this would have more of an impact. These series of articles or essays would have more of an impact if they were published in one form. And that is essentially what becomes common sense. So even if you flip through common sense today, right, you'll see it's sort of separated into different sections. You can see that narrative structure, which then becomes sort of cleaned up and written in a much more linked together or cohesive way. The initial intention is going to be maybe something that looks more like the Federalist Papers, right? These series of articles. But that doesn't come to pass. And that winds up being a very significant editorial choice because Common Sense, or as it's originally titled, Plain Truths, just comes out so strongly out of the gate because you can sit down in one reading, go through it, talk about it in one setting. It has a cohesion that you would not necessarily have had if it had been published serially. Perhaps. We don't know, right? It's a counterfactual. Maybe it would have, but that's the backstory. That's how it comes together.
What do you think made Common Sense so powerful? I mean, John Adams went on to famously gripe that Thomas Paine got all the credit for basically summarizing the ideas of independence and the arguments for it that he and others had been making in the Second Continental Congress since 1775, but people read Paine's pamphlet in a way that they didn't respond to the news leaking out of the Second Continental Congress. So what do you think made Paine's writing so powerful that people wanted to read this pamphlet and share it?
Poor John Adams is a little bit grumpy, but perhaps in fairness to Adams, they're a crew, right? They're a group, they're a community of people, not just men, right? Not just Anglo-Americans, not just English people, who are thinking about these ideas and in pretty consistent conversation about them. And it's worth maybe noting here that you can't own an idea. You can own an expression of an idea or a styling of an idea, but sort of who said what first in what way, there's a sharing of ideas that is happening here that's going to be the spark or the inspiration, at least conceptually, behind a lot of these revolutionary momentum. So we'll give that to John Adams. However, the originality of Common Sense is very much in the ideas. The ideas do have a ton of originality to them. It is also the expression of the ideas that is remarkably original. Some of the statistics can be kind of overwhelming. And I should note too, and scholars like Trish Loughran, for example, have really thoughtful analysis about the nature of these statistics and what the impact actually means, right? Who's influencing who and on what terms. But essentially, we know with reasonable confidence that over 120,000 pamphlets were likely printed in the first year alone, and that over 500,000 copies were likely sold over the course of the War for Independence. And part of why those statistics are not cut and dry is that there are authorized editions, there are unauthorized editions, there are reprints, there are piracies. And it doesn't also account for people who buy a copy, then hand it over to someone else. How much of the interactions are also going to be oral, right? Oral literature is in and of itself an incredibly powerful, longstanding tradition in all different parts of the world. And the reading and verbal discussions of Common Sense are also incredibly influential too. But it really does have a zeitgeist kind of effect. And we can deliberate, we can talk about echo chambers and who's doing the reading and who is doing the purchasing. But what we do know is that a lot of people are. That's a tough statistic to beat.
But what about Paine's expressions in Common Sense moved people? If we think about where the American people are by January 1776, they were fed up with the imperial government, and they really had just started to realize that the fighting that had broken out at Lexington and Concord was going to be a much longer conflict than most of them initially anticipated. But Paine's words somehow fired up enough people so that by July 1776, most Americans who had been reluctant to seek and declare their independence from Great Britain were now celebrating their new Declaration of Independence. So, how did Paine's words help Americans make this shift from reluctance to celebration?
That is a fabulous question. The way that I would probably go about thinking about this question of impact, about how does he move the needle, comes back to this point about audience, which we've been chatting about now, for the last 45 minutes, which is if you are a diehard loyalist, it's unlikely that you're going to pick up a copy of Common Sense. And if you are already sold, you probably love Common Sense. And I can get in just a second about sort of what about the pamphlet is going to be so arresting. The really key critical audience here are those who are undecided. It's those who could go either way. And in many respects, the allure of Common Sense is right there in the title. We hear that today. And I was having a conversation with a colleague a couple of months ago, and why Common Sense is becoming in some ways a more challenging concept, right? We live in a world today in our very sort of diverse and wide-ranging media where it's sometimes very hard to know what's true, what's false, right? How to separate out fact from what could be a fake video. AI is also transforming a lot of these conversations, right? So it can be maybe harder to tell necessarily what is, quote, common sense or the original title, A Plain Truth. What is so important about this pamphlet is that the accessible tone states in a very clear way why independence is intuitive. And there's a few parts of the pamphlet that I think speak to this most clearly. If I had to kind of break it down into 3 key points, the first one, I think the really big common sense or plain truth that moves that needle, that pivot point that sets up the primer for the Declaration is anti-monarchy, anti-hereditary rule. And why I say hereditary rule in addition to monarchy is that it's not just a king that's a problem. It's not just a king. It's the notion that you are born into authority that you did not earn. Over the last few years, we've heard a lot about the quote unquote Nepo baby discourse, right? And I always think about Thomas Paine whenever I hear that. So on the one hand, people often go into very similar professions from that of their parents, right? It makes sense why. And that's also very different, though, than an entitlement, being owed authority by virtue of simply the resources you were born into. That, in some ways, is the plainest of all plain truths that Paine talks about. The second one is representative government, that you should have the people who are leading you represent you. This is something he picks up in Lewis. It's something that's going to continue, throughout his career that he's really committed to. And that, I think, is a really significant part too. And the third part, or the third reason why I think Paine's really able to pivot folks, in addition to this anti-hereditary rule and representative government, I think it's the importance of freedom of expression. Paine makes that point. He talks about freedom for learning, access to information, and common sense for sure. But common sense kind of embodies that point. It's the medium and the message, right? That the importance of access to knowledge, of access to information. And Paine perceives the British government of pretty extreme censorship, of eroding that expression, that exchange. And so those are what he sees as 3 pretty plain truths, and a lot of his readers agree with him.
We know from speaking with other historians that Thomas Jefferson had help writing the Declaration of Independence, that John Adams and Benjamin Franklin both provided critical feedback on his draft that left us with its powerful lines. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jane wonders if Thomas Paine likewise received help with writing and editing Common Sense.
Well, thank you again to Jane. That's another terrific question. And Jane has really hit the nail right on the head, because this is actually a fairly, I would say, vibrant topic of conversation amongst Paine scholars and people who study Paine closely, is what was the extent of Paine's involvement in the Declaration. There's some really exciting and interesting new work coming out on this topic. There's a new collected works collection coming out, I believe, in the spring of 2026. That's going to take into account, I think, the Declaration and Paine's writing with it. I haven't seen the text, but I understand that project is looking at the Declaration question. We think of authorship, I think, as a very solitary activity. There's a lot of images of people, sort of the quote, starving artist in the garret, right, scribbling over their paper by themselves. And that myth is simply not borne out by reality. And it is a myth. It's not how the vast majority of writers, or artists for that matter, of any form across time and space have created their works. And Paine and late 18th century authorship is no exception. authorship is very much a collaborative enterprise. And it's, oh, looking over your friend's shoulder, you should change that sentence. Or, oh, let me give you feedback on this. Or, I don't love that. To understand the Declaration, and I think common sense on a lot of the texts of the late 18th century, they're best understood in networks of authorship, in networks of writing and contribution. And so I think that Paine certainly is in those networks of conversation around the Declaration. And he certainly is a sort of an influential voice in them. In terms of what sentence was written by who, I can't really speculate to that. That's a little beyond my wheelhouse, I'm afraid. But I think he's in the very, to use a Hamilton reference, he's in the very extended room where it happens.
Now, we've talked a little bit about the circulation of Common Sense, and that we noted it was the most widely circulated pamphlet in early American history. Do we know anything about what that really means? Is there a way for us to quantify how many people read Common Sense, especially when it seems like so many people either borrowed the pamphlet from someone else or learned about its ideas just from everyday interactions and talking about it?
Yes. And this is where, once again, that social media influencer, you think you know, but everything old is new again. X and Twitter and TikTok and Instagram are not maybe quite as separate from the past as we like to think they are. To put a number on it, if the statistics that are generally accepted about the circulation of Common Sense are accurate, then you can estimate that about 20% of the Anglo-American population bought Common Sense during its initial print runs, which, to the best of my knowledge, and that's just domestic, right? That's just in North America. It is really hard to think of an example. And there's been really interesting work too for any readers who are interested in this about Bibles and Bible sales. And that's really probably the only other text that I think would probably even come into the conversation. Then you have similar parallel intersecting discussions about Uncle Tom's Cabin when that comes to be published in the mid-19th century. But beyond those other two texts, it's hard pressed to think of a book in quite some time that in the first 5 years of publication that 20% of the population of the United States has read. That's a pretty unique statistic. And that does not even, as you said, account for people who handed off their copies or who talked about it. Right? Part of the fun of reading is talking about it, talking about what you read and discussing it. So if we sort of stretch that out, and once again, we are talking about the Anglo-American population, right? We do not have statistics for other communities and other subjects and citizens, right, who live in North America at that time. But it's a pretty unparalleled statistic. And I'm hard pressed to think of a present day book that would have necessarily that same level of, put it this way, I think our friends in publishing would be absolutely falling back in their chairs if we could show up with a book that 20% of the country would buy. That would be a pretty popular position if we had that.
That's pretty remarkable, because if we think about this, there were about 2.5 million people who lived in the 13 British American colonies that became the United States in 1776. And as you said, Americans likely purchased around 500,000 copies of Common Sense, which, as you said, Nora, is 20% of the new United States' population who bought a copy of Common Sense. And if we think about a popular example of a mega bestseller book today, which Nora and I just paused for a moment and researched, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, which sold 6 million copies when it was released in 2006, that was a mega bestseller. The US population in 2006 was about 300 million people. So Dan Brown's wildly popular book sold to about 5% of the then American population. And Thomas Paine's wildly popular pamphlet sold to 20% of the US population. So that comparison is pretty powerful and just gives us an idea of just how widely circulated this pamphlet was.
Which is absolutely incredible. My stepmother is a novelist. I've had the wonder to be surrounded by book people all the time. And let me tell you, 5% of the population is absolutely incredible. And lest we forget, also spawns a movie with the wonderful Tom Hanks. So if Tom Hanks is interested in playing Thomas Paine in a Common Sense movie, be very curious to know how those sales are going to be. But yes, and all joking aside, and again, I'm only half joking about Tom Hanks playing Thomas Paine in a Common Sense movie, which I think would be absolutely fantastic. Just look at those statistics. Da Vinci Code is one of the most remarkably selling books of the 21st century, right? It's the publisher's dream. It's incredibly successful. Dan Brown is an immensely popular author. And we can maybe take into account that reading cultures shift over time and so on and so forth. But even if you account for percentages of who buys books and who uses libraries versus audiobooks, Kindle books, all these different mechanisms for reading, all that is to say, it shows you just sort of how like singularly impressive the sales of Common Sense were by the standards of the information of which we have available.
Now, something that may surprise you, and I know it surprised me, is that when Thomas Paine first published Common Sense, he did so anonymously. In fact, people like John Adams were gossiping about who might have written Common Sense because people didn't know. Nora, why did Thomas Paine choose to publish his work anonymously?
Anonymity is a very popular publication practice at the time. And once again, I know this keeps coming up over the course of our conversation, but when we think about anonymity in digital publishing today or internet interactions, oftentimes we are thinking about it in terms of avoiding accountability, perhaps, or a lot of the discourses focus on perhaps more the negative components of anonymity or the harm that can come from cruelty or defamatory exchanges or things like that. And that's very, very important conversations to have. And not to imply that those don't also take place in the late 18th century. But oftentimes when you hear about anonymity in the late 18th century, it's a protective measure because this is a time where freedom of speech is not guaranteed, right? Freedom of expression is not protected in the North American colonies. And so people publish anonymously and they cannot trace your IP address in quite the same way. There cannot be these other mechanisms, but people publish anonymously to protect themselves from repercussions from governing authorities. And once again, when we talk about censorship, censorship is when a government or governing institution limits your right to free speech. It's not, for example, if Thomas Paine walked down, a row of printers and went to different shops and two people turned him down to publish him and the third person said yes, which was not in fact what happened, right? But hypothetically, no, that's commerce, right? That's capitalism. That's how sort of exchange works in those settings. When a government entity prohibits you from publishing what you want to publish and there is no defamatory or libelous or problematic content or dangerous content in it, that's what people publish anonymously to avoid. In other words, they wanted to be able to publish things that might be critical of the government and criticism that are grounded in fact, grounded in evidence. And so they would turn to anonymity. And I know I'm giving a lot of equivocating here, but your right to publish something that's a lie is not protected. But your right to publish something that's true is, or now it is, was not the case then. So Paine turns to anonymity first and foremost to protect himself. He does use a mild pseudonym. You might say, I say mild because it's a pretty general one. It's an Englishman. And so he is differentiating himself, for example, than a everyday Anglo-American or someone who's born in America. And he's doing that to indicate or intimate that he has some kind of outside expertise or experience. So it's a little bit of a wink and a nod there too. Like, I'm an Englishman and I'm telling you the British government's not great. And the second reason is you see a stylistic choice amongst a lot of writers of this period, which is if you either publish anonymously or pseudonymously, meaning you use a pseudonym, it's a way to almost separate yourself from your work. Almost a tool against accusations of bias. If you're like, I want the work to speak for itself, I don't want you to necessarily associate my work, my expression with me, but I want it to stand on its own and you evaluate it on its own. So there's also an argument that Paine was stylistically doing that as well. It doesn't last for very long, but those are really the two fundamental reasons why he would have made that choice.
And when did Paine come out as the author? When did he claim credit for his work?
Very quickly. The status of Thomas Paine and Common Sense was addressed within basically a few months of publication. And part of this had to do with a lot of curiosity. People were intrigued to know who wrote it because it was becoming so popular. Another part of this has to do with the fact that oftentimes people would publish anonymously or with pseudonyms and everybody would know who they were. But once again, it was a wink and a nod so that if censoring actors were to come through, they'd have that protection. Basically, like other good faith actors wouldn't have a problem, but if you meant harm, it would protect you. And the other reason was that Paine had a pretty substantial falling out with the publisher or the printer and bookseller of common sense. And their dispute essentially spilled over into public conversation. So people found out who the author of Common Sense was because of the public fight with its publisher.
Nora, as we're in the midst of the 250th anniversary of Common Sense's publication, what do you think this pamphlet's legacies are? And what do you think the legacy of Thomas Paine is with regard to Common Sense 250 years later?
So we are in a very unique moment, right? We're approaching the 250th anniversary of independence. And because Common Sense does occupy this unique place in the revolution, it is sort of this singular document, this singular text. And it is such a significant pamphlet in just the history of communication writ large that really does make the legacy of Common Sense come to the forefront in those situations. So in other words, what does Common Sense tell us about the 250th anniversary of independence? I think it shows that the principles that highlighted the American Revolution are very much enduring ones. They are not necessarily solved or resolved. It's an enduring struggle, an enduring pursuit. There's a line in Common Sense that I really, really like. And it talks about how, quote, men who look upon themselves born to reign and others to obey soon grow insolent. That they are selected, quote, from the rest of mankind, so their minds are early poisoned by importance, and the world they act in differs so materially from the world at large, they have but little opportunity of knowing its true interests. And when they succeed to the government, are frequently the most ignorant and unfit throughout any of the dominions. I know it's a long quote, but to me, that encapsulates the legacy of Common Sense. The legacy of Common Sense, I think, is defined by an understanding that we are collectively in this together, that we as the nation, as different communities within this nation, are bound together, and that one singular person does not chart the course of our civic duty, of our civic engagement, and our republic. We are all born to reign, right? We are all born to collectively reign together. And I think that is a really singular thing to think about as we consider the complicated and inspiring and challenging and messy and disappointing legacies of the revolution. That strikes me as a really meaningful way to think about it. In terms of Paine's legacy today in general, I really go back to Paine as embodying the importance of communication. And I know we're having this conversation digitally through these really cool technologies where we get to talk through and think about these cool ideas and then get to interact hopefully with your wonderful listeners and hear their thoughts and their views, right? And it just stresses that communication amongst people in different backgrounds, different experiences, different places, different jobs. Common Sense is really like embodies the values of dialogue and engaging with each other.
Well, speaking of a dialogue, now it's time for the time warp. This is the segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Nora, in your opinion, what might have happened if Thomas Paine had never written Common Sense? How might the course of the American Revolution have been different?
I don't know if anyone who's listening, or hopefully who listens, has ever seen the movie with Gwyneth Paltrow and John Hannah from the 90s called Sliding Doors, where the entire plot of the movie hinges on one woman missing the subway or getting on the subway, right? The sliding door or the butterfly effect. I'm not sure that Common Sense is the sliding door, right? That if Common Sense is not published, the war for independence never happens. I don't think history is that neat. But if I was hopping in a TARDIS or taking this time warp, I don't know that the revolutionary aspects of the war for independence would have been as successful. I think a war for independence was coming. And whether or not it would be won or lost without Common Sense, that I don't know. I think the outcome of the war, if it came to pass, would probably be relatively similar. And there are lots of things that happen after independence that break Paine's heart, that he sees this as this moment for really seismic change and transformation. And not all the changes and transformations that he's hoping for, a expansive democracy and all the different values that espouses, don't necessarily come to pass. But the parts of the revolution that are indeed revolutionary, those values, I think those are immeasurably helped by common sense. And so maybe the time warp in a nutshell would be, I'm not sure what is revolutionary about the revolution would be quite so revolutionary without common sense.
Nora, it's the 250th anniversary of Common Sense. So how is the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies commemorating and celebrating this big anniversary?
We have a pretty expansive docket of commemorations lined up as we reflect on common sense in all its complexities, its best parts, its most inspiring parts, its most challenging parts, where it perhaps falls short of its own aspirations, right? Its own goals. All of those conversations are ongoing. I'm especially excited on behalf of the ITPS. I'm especially excited to be collaborating with Clio Digital Media on a series of really exciting digital programs that will be available to everyone that are going to show us pretty close reads and exciting documentations and supports about common sense, how Paine comes to write it, really cool aspects of the archive, maybe parts of Paine's process that really aren't that publicly or widely talked about or known. We're also collaborating with Thomas Paine Legacy and the University of Sussex in January of 2026 on a really exciting conference called Common Sense at 250, which is quite literally taking place on the 250th anniversary of Common Sense in Paine's earlier home at Bull House in Lewes, England, where we'll be collaborating with Ben Franklin's World on a very exciting panel that will also dive deep into the commemorations of the text itself.
Yes, Joe Edelman and I are really excited to be partnering with the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies to create all of the digital content that Nora just mentioned. It's content that's really going to allow us to tour Paine's residence in Lewes, England, the Bull House, and we'll also dive into the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies archival collections about Paine and common sense. So we're excited to bring you even more historical adventures about Thomas Paine and common sense, both on this podcast and in our newsletter. It's in the coming months as we move closer to July 2026. Now, Nora, you also personally have a book coming out in 2026 called The Free Engine of Expression, Copyright in the State in Early America. Would you give us a sneak preview?
Sure. So thank you. It's very exciting. You work on these books for a while and then you hear wonderful friends and colleagues mention them and then it finally feels real. But yes, my book is coming out in December of 2026. It looks at the relationship between copyright and other forms of intellectual property and the rise of the federal government in early America.
Fantastic. Now, if we have more questions about Paine, common sense, or the events we might attend at the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies, where is the best place for us to get in contact with you and learn more?
Yes, please reach out to us at any point. We would love to hear from you. Everyone knows that Ben Franklin's World has the absolute best listeners there are. You can sign up for our newsletter, which is called Page of Reason, an ode to Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, in case you were wondering. And please look out for our special episode with Ben Franklin's World, hosted by Joe, which is called A Template for Democracy, Common Sense, and Civic Life.
Nora Slonimsky, thank you for introducing us to Thomas Paine, his famous and widely circulated pamphlet, Common Sense, and the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies. We learned a lot and really enjoyed ourselves.
Thank you so much for having me. It was absolutely wonderful conversation.
Thomas Paine's Common Sense was more than just a call for independence. It was a bold challenge to monarchy, a defense of representative government, and a celebration of free expression. And thanks to Paine's accessible writing style and the pamphlet's wide circulation, Common Sense helped reshape the American Revolution from a protest movement into a radical demand for self-rule. Now, as Nora noted, Paine's early life in England, his work as a tax collector, his experience with labor advocacy, and his immersion in Enlightenment ideas all laid the groundwork for Common Sense, which became revolutionary America's first bestseller. Plus, as Nora also noted, Common Sense continues to inform our ideas about civic participation and public discourse today. Now, Common Sense was not created in a vacuum. It wasn't Paine, the lonely author, sitting up in his garret writing about common sense. Common Sense was born out of a vibrant network of reformers, printers, thinkers, and writers, many of whom, like Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush, helped to shape Paine's ideas and ensure that they reached the widest audience possible. Now, as Nora pointed out, authorship is often a collaborative enterprise, and Paine's success reminds us of the collective and collaborative effort behind revolutionary change. So as we consider the legacy of Common Sense and how it endures, not only in its content, but also in its form, the accessible and engaging writing style aimed at everyday people. We should also consider the enduring power of clear, persuasive communication and the people's need for it in moments of political and social transformation. Look for more information about the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona University, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we discussed today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/431. If you're interested in learning more about Thomas Paine and his work, be sure you visit benfranklinsworld.com/Paine. That's Paine with an E on the end. When you visit benfranklinsworld.com/Paine, you'll be able to stay in touch and learn more about Clio Digital Media's partnership with the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies, plus the release of all that digital content we're going to create about Paine and his work. This content will include a virtual tour of Paine's English residence in Lewes, England, the Bull House. So again, if you'd like to stay in touch and learn more about the release of this digital content, visit benfranklinsworld.com/Paine. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, Thomas Paine's common sense helped ordinary people, everyday people, see themselves as part of a revolutionary moment. What kinds of writing, media, and messages have helped you think differently about the world and your role in it? I'd love to know, so tell me. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com.